Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. This week it's just going to be me and you attending today, where I'm going to be kind of taking a look back at my career as an industry analyst over the past almost 15 years now, and kind of highlighting some of the major trends that I've seen in the industry over that time, as well as share with you, some of my insights or takeaways from that might be important to think about moving forward. Just to remind you, if you have any questions or comments throughout, feel free to post them either via the chat feature or the submit a question button, and I'll keep an eye on it. And if you've got a good question, I'll try to address it, assuming I know the answer. Just as a reminder, you do have to be registered to be able to ask a question. So with that, this is kind of a little bit different role for an industry analyst. I mean, most of the times, my main function and role is really to look at, kind of current trends and kind of look out toward the future and talk about what's going to be happening down the road. But, the other day I was just reflecting a little bit on all the changes that have occurred since I started out as an industry analyst. And I kind of got into this industry, I like to say almost a little bit by accident. My background's actually in engineering, material science engineering, and I started my career at Motorola in the semiconductor industry doing manufacturing and new product development. And without going through all the details, about 15 years ago, I joined a research analyst firm and got involved with supply chain management and logistics research. Um, and that's the rest is history, if you will. So as I was thinking about the kind of some of these trends that I've seen, I started writing them down. I had a huge list of things that I wanted to talk about, of things that I identified, and I quickly realized that this would be a multiple hour discussion if I focused on everything. So what I decided to do was really to roll up some of these trends into some high level categories and break it down into technology trends, 3PL trends, and broader industry trends. So that's really what I'm going to focus on right now. So it's not by any means a comprehensive list, but just again, some of these high level things that I've seen and kind of resonate with me as I reflect back. So talking about the first technology trend, and I'm going to put it up here on the screen, is seeing the move away from proprietary client server solutions to more standards based cloud architectures. Certainly when I got into the industry, late 90s, the web was just coming into use at corporations. So a lot of the applications were still more, resident on the computer. Certainly the browser, using the browser as a user interface was not common back then. And if you looked at all the different vendors, they all really had their own proprietary architectures and ways about developing their applications, which really one of the big challenges that resulted was integrating all of these applications. So you kind of fast forward to today. A lot of the vendors, I would say virtually all the vendors today, have kind of moved on to standards-based architectures. The solutions today are much easier. As a result, they're much easier to configure with these more modern architectures. They're easier to integrate. Not to say that it's exactly plug and play, but certainly it's a much easier task today because of the standards that are out there and the adoption of those standards. And then easier and faster to update. And I use the word update deliberately because of cloud application software as a service. You're really talking about now the ability for updates to be downloaded onto the application or to be available versus the traditional sense of upgrading, where it was a much longer involvement. In many cases, the upgrade took as long and cost as much as the initial implementation. So even just the way these applications are now, new innovations are introduced into these applications and users can get access to them has changed. So that's one of the big high-level trends that I've seen in the industry, and of course, there's a lot of subtopics within that. The second technology trend is this move beyond features and functions, where the focus is really now on a variety of different topics. When I started in the industry, there was a big emphasis on this ERP versus best of breed debate. And certainly, if you look back at the late '90s, the ERP, players in general, were very focused on, the financials and the HR, and the supply chain capabilities were weak or non-existent. Over time, which is part of the reason why best of breeds enter the market in the first place, to kind of fill in those holes in warehouse management, transportation management, supply chain planning, and so forth. Over time, we saw the ERP players kind of start migrating now into, first customer relationship management. That became a big area of focus for them, and then eventually into supply chain management, probably in the mid 2000s. And what we saw there was a lot of these ERP players acquiring best of breeds, investing more R&D into those applications. So if you fast forward to today, really there's much more parity, these days between the applications out there, and the definition of what is a best of breed versus the debate between ERP and best of breed is a little bit more or a little less relevant today than it was 15 years ago, just because of all the evolution that's taking place in the vendor market, and kind of how the R&D has developed and so forth. So really the focus today is obviously features and functions remain important from a user standpoint in terms of choosing an application that's going to align with your requirements. But users and customers out there are really focusing on other things as well that are kind of, I would argue, are taking even center stage. And that is time to benefit. The ability to be able to gain functionality to enable a business process sooner rather than later. So, the days of having to wait a year or more to be able to access the application, that's become a thing of the past. And certainly, if that's the case, if that's what a vendor is offering today, they're going to be at a disadvantage compared to others that can either through more flexible architectures, through their deployment model, and so forth, can enable a customer to get benefit faster. Like I talked about before, quick ongoing innovation, the ability to get new features and functions in a more timely manner through, and particularly, software as a service is a good example of that. To be able to, tap into new functionality, in a matter of days or weeks versus, having to go through a big complicated upgrade, I think is something else that's becoming more and more important. And then usability and ease of use, and that's something I've been talking a lot about, this year, where the user interface and usability is becoming a competitive differentiator for technology vendors today. And so if you take those things together, time to benefit, quick ongoing innovation and usability, I mean, that in part is what's driving, the trend today towards, cloud solutions and software as a service applications. So again, those are my two high-level tech trends. Again, not a comprehensive list, but I think those two really capture, at a high level, some of the big transformations that have taken place in the industry from a technology standpoint. Let me shift now to 3PL trends, and I've got a few here. The first one is this evolution from services to solutions. So, certainly years ago, you saw a lot of 3PLs that were, came to market, and they started out, focusing just on transportation solutions, and it might have been just trucking. Others were more focused on warehousing. You had those that were more brokers. And over the years, what you've seen in an effort to provide a greater value proposition to customers is the coming together of those different services and packaging them and offering them in such a way that you create more of an end-to-end solution for clients. So, this move away from providing siloed, standalone services to really packaging together a broader variety of services to focus on the specific needs of an industry, and even more broadly, expanding globally as well. That has been one of the big trends that have gone on in the 3PL industry, and certainly that has been enabled through a lot of mergers and acquisitions that have taken place over the past decade. And we're seeing today ongoing interest from the financial community and investors, private equity firms, VCs, really focusing on the 3PL logistics services industry, as a growth opportunity, as a way to, again, bring together a lot of these disparate, fragmented companies and bundling them together again, to increase the value proposition, increase the value of the company. So certainly that, this move from this evolution from services to solutions is one of the key, trends that I've seen in the 3PL industry. The other one is what I like to say is the merging of operations with technology and consulting. So it's no longer good enough, if you will, for a 3PL to be, to achieve operational excellence. I mean, that's the expectations. That's the, the ticket to the dance on behalf of the, from a customer's perspective. So you have to be up, you have to provide from an operations standpoint, excellent service in that department. But again, aligned with, this movement toward, providing a broader value proposition to clients, you see in 3PLs investing more heavily in technology and providing clients with technology solutions, as well as, consulting services. So, in some ways, you're seeing kind of the business models of 3PLs, technology companies, and consulting firms really coming together over the past few years. And if you look at just the technology side, I mean, a lot of 3PLs are offering, transportation management solutions, for example, as a service. So they've become a SaaS provider of that type of technology. And in many cases, you see some 3PLs that actually have larger IT and R&D staffs than some pure play technology companies. So even though 3PLs have gotten a bad rap years ago in terms of not being tech savvy, if you really peel back the onion and look at some of the leaders out there in the industry, they're actually very sophisticated when it comes to technology these days, and are doing some interesting things on that front. And on the consulting side, again, consulting has now become kind of the door opener for them in terms of engaging with clients, in terms of doing things like network design, inventory optimization, and so forth. And that's a way for them to showcase their, again, their people talent, that position their talent as a competitive differentiator, and be able to provide customers and potential customers with some insight. So again, network design, consulting becoming a sales tool, if you will, and a competitive differentiator for 3PLs. So those were the kind of the two high level trends that I saw in the 3PL industry. Shifting gears now and talk about kind of broader industry trends. There are a few that I want to highlight. And again, this is probably where I had my biggest set of lists and things that I could potentially be talking about today. But I kind of narrowed it down to a few. The first one is supply chain gets a seat at the executive suite table. When I started my career in the industry, you heard a lot from a lot of logistics executives that they were kind of the Rodney Dangerfields, right? They really got no respect within the company. They were viewed as a cost center. It was not viewed as strategic. The alignment between supply chain logistics and the company's strategic objectives and the financial side of things, that connection was a little bit fuzzy. So on the one hand, the CEO, the CFO didn't understand supply chain and logistics, and on the other side, supply chain logistics executives really didn't know how to speak the language of the CEO, CFO to kind of help them understand better. Over the years, we've seen that change dramatically. I think now most executives in the C-suite understand the vital importance of supply chain management and logistics, and understand that supply chain management in many cases is the enabler of their overall business strategy. And in conjunction with that, I think probably that's part of what's enabled that is we've seen the rise of undergraduate, graduate MBA programs that have been focusing on supply chain and logistics programs and preparing the next generation of leaders in this field. So, certainly I would say that supply chain logistics is no longer the Rodney Dangerfield of within the corporation, and it's getting a lot more respect these days, and certainly more visibility in the C-suite. And in some cases, actually the folks in the C-suite came out of supply chain and logistics function. So that's the first thing. The second one that I think is a very positive move for the industry as well is we're seeing more women and minorities in supply chain executive positions. Again, when I started the industry and I would go to trade shows and conferences, and you looked around, there was a low level of diversity out there. It was predominantly men out in the audience, and you saw very few women or minorities in the audience. Certainly, there's more more work to be done in this area, but today you're seeing many more women in executive positions in supply chain management, as well as minorities. Some of them in the highest levels of the company, some of them leading technology companies. So overall, this has been a positive development in the industry, and certainly, part of it is as companies have outsourced and offshored, and having to work with folks in different cultures and different countries. It's really helped in terms of making supply chain management a melting pot, if you will, in terms of bringing people from a variety of different cultures and backgrounds together to be able to work towards a common goal. So that's another high-level industry trend that I've seen that I think has been a positive for the industry. The third one is that companies are taking a more holistic view of supply chains. And again, I think the work here is not complete yet, but certainly, when I started the industry, it was very much siloed, right? So transportation didn't talk to warehousing as much, or the folks in demand planning didn't talk to transportation. Certainly, there was a lot of animosity between purchasing and the logistics function, so on and so forth. And some of that still exists today, but by and large, I think companies have finally recognized that supply chain management is a system, and if you try to optimize just one part of that system, you might be throwing something else out of whack. That you really need to take a complete view of your supply chain, and have more cross-functional metrics in place in order to more efficiently and more smartly run your supply chains. And I think we're seeing that, in the areas of total landed cost, for example. I'm seeing more and more companies, begin to think about that more and take that into consideration. And one of the effects that you see of that is this whole trend now, where you can make the argument that a lot of the offshoring that went on in the late '90s and early 2000s, to China and other places, was because of this very siloed focus on just labor cost. And I think now, as companies are taking a broader perspective of cost, as an example, and kind of a broader perspective of their supply chain networks, I think part of the reason you're seeing companies move things, nearshoring and onshoring again, is part of that, is because they're taking a much broader perspective of their supply chain networks. So again, high-level trend there. Companies moving away from a kind of a siloed, fragmented view of supply chains to taking a more holistic view and understanding, how all the different pieces affect one another and need to be in synchronization with one another to, achieve the greatest benefits. Number 4 is risk management is becoming more important, and I've done, I've done a couple episodes so far this year on risk management. I believe again, this is an area that more and more companies need to work on. But I think because if you've seen the number of disruptions that have taken place in the industry, they seem to be greater. For me, I think the watershed movement was 9/11, which was something that affected many companies and forced a lot of companies to think about business continuity. Certainly, we had a lot of natural disasters over the past 15 years, with Katrina and the Japan earthquake and the tsunamis, and that always, every time one of those big events happen, disruptions happen, risk management comes into the forefront, and people think about that. But if you look at it just from, increased regulations, what's going on in Syria today, in the Middle East, the fact that product life cycles are shrinking, what's happening with currency, IT, and cyber attacks, the list goes on and on. So definitely just a lot more things that could go wrong, if you will, and just the rapid change of pace that's in the business environment today is just inherently creating more risk for supply chain managers. And as a result, they're beginning to think more about supply chain risk management. I think, as I've talked about in previous episodes, I think what's missing now is, taking a more formalized and smarter approach to risk management than they have in the past, versus being a more responsive or reactive approach, which has been the norm to date. And the last technology trend, I think, is, this is kind of a high-level one. Didn't put too much detail into this one, but it's just that, the pace of change is just accelerating. I mean, one of the buzzwords around supply chain management is that you talk about it being a dynamic business environment, and certainly that was true 15 years ago. But it just seems to me, and when I talk to supply chain executives, I was asked recently, what's the biggest challenge you hear from supply chain executives and manufacturers, retailers, 3PLs and so forth. And I would say that the biggest challenge I hear from them is the fact that things are just changing so quickly, and how do they keep up with that change? Particularly if their IT systems can't keep up with it, if their business processes can't keep up with it, if their organizational structures can't keep up with it because it takes too many levels of approval to get something changed, so on and so forth. So I think that is one of the biggest things that I've seen over the past 15 years. And I think it's only going to get worse, moving forward. And companies are going to have to, figure out a way to continue to succeed despite, the rapid change. So that kind of covered all the different, trends that I've seen over the past 15 years. Again, from a high level consolidated, standpoint. I'd be curious to see what other things folks out there might, put on their list. But let me now kind of conclude by sharing a few insights or takeaways. Things that in some ways things have changed a lot over the past 15 years, and in many ways things stay the same. So many of these are kind of the things have stayed the same category. And the first one is that poor data quality remains the Achilles heel of supply chain management. So even though there's such a strong focus and buzz today around business intelligence and analytics, and the power of what you can do with all this data, the reality is that that only works if the data you have is timely, accurate, and complete. And unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons, companies still suffer from poor data quality. Just last week, as an example, I tweeted about this. I was at Home Depot returning a product, and the customer in front of me was looking to exchange a product, and he wanted to get he just wanted to replace it because that one wasn't working. He wanted to get the same model, and he went over to the shelf, and there weren't any there on the shelf. When he asked the customer service rep there at the desk, he said, "Well, the computer shows that there are 5." Right? So here you got a situation where the inventory system says that there are 5 units in stock. Meanwhile, the customer goes to the shelf and there's none in there. So what's the issue, right? So it could be a data entry problem, or it could be that the product is actually there, but it's misplaced somewhere. It's still in the back room or the receiving dock. So again, and you see countless examples of this out there. And then that has a ripple effect in terms of how effective you can manage your supply chain. So unless you've got good data quality, a lot of these other things that we talk about in supply chain management, you really can't do that effectively. And unfortunately, the problem has only gotten worse over the years as you've introduced more partners into the equation. As you deal with more systems, as you introduce new products, so SKU proliferation. So a lot of different factors, mobile and the power that consumers have now, and the data generated by consumers. So the stakes are higher for having more accurate data, but there's a lot more factors that impact data quality today too that companies have to manage. So again, I still see this as this has been my soapbox issue for the past 15 years, and it's a challenge that companies still continue to wrestle with. The other challenge that they continue to wrestle with is visibility. So, I mean, this is probably one of those buzz terms that you hear in the industry. I've been hearing in the industry for the past 15 years, where that's like the number 1 or number 2 priority that companies have is they want greater visibility, to their shipments, to inventory, to events taking place in the industry. But yet they still have a lot of black holes within their supply chain. Maybe they only have visibility up to their tier 1 suppliers, and it's a black hole after that. And we certainly see continued examples of that, where even with the recent tragedies in Bangladesh and in other places, where some companies didn't even know that these suppliers were manufacturing product on their behalf or transporting products on their behalf, because their visibility only went so far, right? So when you talk about visibility down to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. That becomes a challenge. And again, the root causes there are poor data quality, the fact that not all your trading partners have, modern IT systems, so on and so forth. So, it's one of those things that hasn't changed in 15 years. Companies still struggle with visibility, and it's something that remains, critically important. And it's something that a lot of companies and technology providers are looking to help companies, uh, um, try to improve on that front. Um, Insight number three: the forecast is always wrong. Despite everything that sales and operations planning and demand planning and everything else, this one's a known entity. No matter how much you forecast and plan, it's always going to be wrong. There's always going to be exceptions. And really, the name of the game today, more than ever, and this ties into the fact of the point that I raised earlier in terms of the rate of change accelerating, is really how quickly and smartly and effectively can you respond to exceptions. Those companies are able to manage exceptions and deal with changes, in terms of what was planned versus what's actually happening. Those are the ones that are going to be successful moving forward. And I think if you recognize that, no matter how much you try to plan and forecast, and I'm not saying you don't do that. You need some kind of a baseline or some kind of guiding posts out there. But I would argue that it's become increasingly difficult to forecast accurately today than it was 15 years ago. So even though you can try, and it's important to have something in place, the real focus should be moving forward is the ability to put in the systems, the processes, the talent in place to be able to respond to those exceptions as quickly and intelligently as possible. Um, Insight number four is poor execution negates benefits of innovation. And I wrote about this and I talked about this earlier this year. I mean, there's so much focus these days on innovation, and rightly so. I mean, you always have to look toward continuous improvement and try to see where there are opportunities to transform processes and things of that nature. But I also see that a lot of companies focus too much on innovation at the expense of executing better. And they're really leaving opportunities on the table because they're dropping the ball on execution. So the example I gave with Home Depot, that happens across the board at retailers where, store level associates aren't replenishing the shelves as quickly as possible, or they're not, when they're scanning things out at checkout, they're not doing it in the right way. You're seeing that in transportation, with the number of empty miles or missed backhaul opportunities out there. So that's a huge missed opportunity out there. Collaboration is one of those things that I didn't put on the list, but I think it's worth mentioning as well. I mean, there's a lot of talk these days, over the years. So I talked about visibility being one of those buzz terms. Another buzz term is collaboration. Companies have been talking about collaboration for so long, yet they haven't been walking the talk as much. Certainly there are many examples of collaboration in action out there, but nearly not enough as you would think. And again, that's an opportunity there to execute better with the systems and the processes that are already in place to kind of tighten up those inefficiencies that exist out there. So while it's okay to go after the next new shiny thing, you also have to recognize that you can achieve some great benefits, in some cases maybe even greater benefits, by just better executing with the systems and processes and the people that you already have. And that brings me to my last point, which is that best-in-class execution requires best-in-class people. A lot of buzz these days around talent and there being a talent shortage and the importance of people, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's good that companies are finally focusing on the important role of people, but I think it's still not enough. And I think historically, companies have made investments in technology, they've made investments in process changes, and they haven't placed as much emphasis on the talent side of the equation. And just speaking from my own personal experience, I mentioned I worked at Motorola when I started my career, and I had the opportunity to work on a manufacturing line that started out as a pilot line and quickly got transformed into a 24/7 operation. And even though we had state-of-the-art technology, even though we had state-of-the-art and completely new and innovative processes in place, the one area that we kind of dropped the ball on was the people side. We didn't invest as much in training. We didn't give a lot of forethought ahead of time before we scaled in terms of the type of people that we would need, the type of skills and attributes that were required. And we were kind of then in a kind of reactive mode, after the fact. And you end up paying for that in the long term, with poor quality, poor execution, so on and so forth. So again, the recognition of best in class. If you want to have best in class execution, you need best in class people. So with that, those were kind of the key trends that I've kind of noticed at a high level over the past 15 years. Some of my insights and takeaways along that time period. And certainly didn't get any questions today. But if you've got any questions or comments related to anything that I talked about today, or you want to add your ideas and thoughts to the list in terms of the trends that you've seen during your time in the industry, or some of your key takeaways, go to the website, talkinglogistics.com. Find this episode on there and post a comment, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions or comments there as well. So again, I want to thank you all for joining me today. Don't forget, mark your calendar for every Thursday at just about every Thursday at 12 o'clock Eastern, where we, in many cases, will have great guests, industry executives and others that are talking about their experience in the front lines of supply chain management. Other weeks it'll just be me sharing some of my thoughts on what's happening in the industry. So again, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.